Maple Drive was one of those idyllic, picturesque streets that looked as if it had been lifted straight out of a suburban dream. Lined with lush trees, manicured lawns, and houses with picket fences, it was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other and waved hello in the mornings. Children rode their bikes freely, and laughter often echoed through the streets. That was until the old man moved in. He arrived suddenly one late autumn evening. No one had seen any moving trucks or people coming in or out of the dilapidated house at the end of the street. It had been abandoned for years, a decaying shell of a building that people avoided. Its windows were cracked, and its paint had peeled off to reveal the rotting wood beneath. So when a dim light appeared in one of the upstairs windows, the neighbors were baffled. His name was Mr. Thorne, or at least that's what he had scrawled on the rusty mailbox. He never spoke, never waved, and never left his property. The children of Maple Drive dubbed him Old Man Thorne, whispering wild rumors that spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Some said he was a ghost, while others swore they'd seen shadows moving inside his house when no one was around. The adults tried to brush off these stories as mere child's play. However, a sense of unease began to creep in, overshadowing the once peaceful street. Strange things started happening. Dogs went missing. The streetlights on Maple Drive flickered at night, and sometimes, late at night, there were muffled screams. The neighborhood's atmosphere thickened with an unexplainable tension, like an impending storm. Then came the Millers. John and Sarah Miller moved in with their teenage daughter, Lila, into the house directly across from Mr. Thorne's. They were new to the neighborhood, unaware of the unsettling history that surrounded the decrepit house across the street. From their porch, they had a perfect view of its sagging roof, darkened windows, and the unkempt yard overgrown with weeds. Lila was the first to notice him. From her bedroom window, she could see directly into the upper rooms of Mr. Thorne's house. At night, she'd occasionally glimpse a figure pacing back and forth in front of a dimly lit window. It was the only source of light in the house, a single bulb that flickered erratically as if struggling against the darkness that encased it. "Mom, there's something off about that old man across the street," Lila said one morning over breakfast. "I saw him staring at me from his window last night." "Oh, honey," Sarah replied, glancing at her husband with a dismissive smile. "He's probably just an old man with nothing better to do." John chimed in, "Yeah, these old houses can make people act a bit eccentric. Just ignore him, sweetheart." But ignoring Mr. Thorne became increasingly difficult. Every time Lila looked out her window, she saw him standing there, staring at her through the curtains. His gaunt face was pale, with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness of his house. He never blinked, never moved, just watched. One evening, Lila was walking home from her friend's house when she noticed something strange. The trees on Maple Drive were rustling furiously, though the air was completely still. As she passed by Mr. Thorne's property, she heard a faint whispering. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, insistent murmur that sent chills up her spine. "Lila!" The voice was barely audible, almost drowned out by the rustling leaves. She froze in place, heart hammering against her chest. She turned slowly to look at the house. In the gloom, she could just make out Mr. Thorne standing on his porch, his head tilted unnaturally to the side. His lips were moving, but no sound came from them. Yet the whispering continued in her ears, growing louder and more urgent. "Lila, come inside. It's safe here." Panicked, she ran home, slamming the door behind her. She rushed upstairs to her parents, her words tumbling out in a frantic mess about Mr. Thorne, the whispers, and his eerie gaze. "Sweetheart, calm down," her father said, trying to soothe her. "We'll talk to him in the morning. He's probably just a lonely old man who wants some company." But Lila wasn't so sure. She felt an impending dread that made her skin crawl. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the hours ticked by. Then at around 2 a.m., she heard it again, faint whispering like a swarm of bees buzzing in her ears. She glanced toward her window and stifled a scream. Mr. Thorne was there, standing right in front of her house. His eyes were gleaming with a sickly yellow light, his lips moving soundlessly. The next morning, Maple Drive woke up to a new horror. The Johnsons' dog was found dead, its body twisted and contorted as if it had been crushed from the inside. Lila overheard her parents talking in hushed tones about how this wasn't the first time a pet had mysteriously died since Mr. Thorne's arrival. "We should have the police look into this," John said, his voice grim. "That old man is bad news." That night, Lila kept her curtains closed, unable to bear the thought of seeing Mr. Thorne again. But sleep eluded her as the whispering began once more. She buried her head under the pillow, praying it would stop. And then there was a loud thump from downstairs. Her parents' voices followed, muffled but urgent. She crept out of bed and opened her door just enough to see her mother and father standing in the hallway. They were staring down the stairs, paralyzed with fear. At the bottom of the stairs stood Mr. Thorne, but not as they had seen him before. He was hunched over, his limbs elongated and distorted, his skin hanging off his bones like melting wax. His eyes shone brightly, casting a pale, sickly light across the walls. "Get out!" John screamed, grabbing a bat from the closet. Mr. Thorne's mouth opened, stretching impossibly wide as if his jaw was unhinging. A black mist began to pour out, swirling and filling the room with a choking, acrid stench. "Leave now!" Sarah shrieked, grabbing Lila and yanking her toward the back door. But as they ran out of the house, Lila turned back just in time to see the mist envelop her father. His screams were strangled and then silenced, swallowed by the darkness that now filled their living room. Mr. Thorne turned toward them, his mouth still gaping open as he glided closer. Lila and her mother sprinted down Maple Drive, pounding on their neighbors' doors, shouting for help. One by one, porch lights flickered on, and doors creaked open to reveal bleary-eyed residents. "He's in our house!" Sarah screamed, gasping for breath. "The old man, he took John." The neighbors exchanged worried glances. They had all sensed something was wrong for months, but none had dared to confront it. Now, faced with the undeniable horror, they knew they had to act. Armed with flashlights, baseball bats, and whatever tools they could find, they cautiously approached Mr. Thorne's house. Its windows were dark, the air around it unnaturally cold. On three, Mr. Johnson, the neighborhood watch captain, said, his voice trembling, "1, 2, 3. They kicked in the door, rushing inside. The interior was dark and stifling, the air thick with the stench of decay. Shadows moved along the walls, darting out of sight as their flashlights swept the room. The whispers started again, low and incessant, echoing off the walls. "Where is he?" someone muttered. They moved deeper into the house, finding room after room filled with nothing. The walls were bare, the floors covered in dust. It was as if the house had been abandoned for decades. Then they heard it, a low guttural laughter emanating from the basement. Heart pounding, Lila led the way down the creaking stairs, her flashlight beam trembling. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, until they reached the bottom. There, in the center of the basement, stood Mr. Thorne. But he was no longer human. His body was twisted and monstrous, a mass of shadows and mist that writhed in the dim light. Faces appeared in the darkness around him, contorted in agony, whispering and laughing in a cacophony of terror. "Join us!" the voices hissed, surrounding the neighbors. "No!" Lila screamed, raising her flashlight. She pointed it directly at Mr. Thorne, and for a moment his form wavered. "Go back!" she yelled, stepping forward. But then, as if reality itself had torn open, Mr. Thorne lunged. The basement filled with a blinding light, a howl of wind, and the screams of the neighbors. When Lila woke up, she was lying on Maple Drive's cracked pavement, the morning sun glaring down at her. People were standing around, dazed and confused. The house at the end of the street was gone, replaced by a barren lot overgrown with weeds. Lila's mother rushed to her, tears streaming down her face. "Are you okay?" she sobbed. "What happened?" Lila muttered, her voice hoarse. "No one knows," Mr. Johnson replied, his face pale. It's like the house and that man were never there. Lila glanced around, trying to make sense of it. The neighbors were whispering, shaking their heads in disbelief. As they all stood there, stunned, a chilling realization washed over Lila. From the corner of her eye, she saw it, a shadow in the shape of a hunched figure standing just beyond the trees. It lingered for a moment, then vanished into the air. Mr. Thorne was gone, for now. But the old man of Maple Drive was not finished. Not yet. Months later, the lot where Mr. Thorne's house once stood remained untouched. No grass grew there, and animals avoided it. Then one night, a light flickered in the empty lot, a single dim light, as if coming from an unseen window. Lila watched from her bedroom, heart pounding, and in the glow she saw a shadowy figure, a familiar figure, with a face pale and eyes glowing faintly. The whispering started again, and this time it wasn't just her who heard it. It drifted through Maple Drive, seeping into every house, every ear. Mr. Thorne had returned, and he was no longer confined to just one house. The neighborhood was his.